Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the Youth Resilience in the Digital Age Conference. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à la conférence sur la résilience des jeunes à l'ère numérique. To begin, the Canadian Teachers Federation and the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada recognize the contributions of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada. In honor of reconciliation and education, we acknowledge and give gratitude to the Indigenous peoples whose lands we are on today. My name is Dan Martin, and I'm the Director of the International and Social Justice Program at the Canadian Teachers Federation, and it is my absolute pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. As we begin, I'd like to recognize that this initiative was made possible by funding from Employment and Social Development Canada, or ESDC, and this week's conference is proudly co-hosted by the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada and the Canadian Teachers Federation. Please note that today's session will be recorded so that the presentation can be available on the platform in the future. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais vous rappeler que la session sera enregistrée pour qu'elle soit disponible après la conférence. A short question and answer period will follow the presentation today. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions to the presenter or to communicate with the technical staff. Feel free to use the chat function to connect with other participants, to share ideas, information, or resources, or simply to interact. Veuillez noter que la session aujourd'hui se déroule en anglais. Cependant, soyez à l'aise à poser vos questions ou à faire des commentaires dans le chat en français ou en anglais. At the end of the presentation, I'll invite the presenter to answer your questions in the order that they were asked. And now I'm very glad to welcome Matthew Johnston, who is the Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. Matthew is the author of many of Media Smart's lessons, parent materials, and interactive resources, and he's a lead on Media Smart's Young Canadian and a Wired World research project. As an acknowledged expert in digital literacy and its implementation in Canadian curricula, Matthew is the architect of Media Smart's Use, Understand, Create digital literacy framework for Canadian K-12 schools. He's contributed blogs and articles to websites and magazines around the world and has presented Media Smart's materials on topics such as copyright, cyberbullying, body image, and online hate to parliamentary committees, academic conferences, government departments, and other organizations in Canada and around the world. He served on expert panels convened by organizations including the Canadian Pediatrics Society and the Ontario Network of Child and Adolescent Inpatient Psychiatric Services. He's done consultations on provincial curriculum with the Ontario Ministry of Education, and he's been interviewed by outlets such as the Globe and Mail, BBC News Magazine, the Christian Science Monitor, Radio-Canada International, and CBC's The National. His presentation this afternoon is called Break the Fake. Welcome, welcome, Matthew. Please excuse me. Welcome, Matthew. Many thanks for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to share our material and to talk about this really, really essential topic. So please welcome to the Break the Fake workshop. As you already heard, we will be taking questions as we go along. I'll be answering them at the end, but I'm going to invite you, if you have any questions, to just post them in the chat as soon as you think of them, because we're going to be covering a lot of ground in the next 45, 50 minutes. And so it's very easy to lose track. I say that from experience. So welcome to the Break the Fake workshop. Today, you're going to learn 4 easy ways to tell if something is true online. And I'm going to start with a few examples to maybe show how that can be more difficult than you think. So to start off, which of these pictures do you think is real? You don't have to say it out loud. Just take a look at these 2 pictures. Which one seems more likely to be real? Which one seems more likely to be fake? The answer is this one. This is called a peacock spider. And these colors are absolutely real. Previous photo was the other photo was mostly real, except the color of the eyes had been changed. Here's a slightly more serious question. Which of these news sources is real? The Buffalo News or the Buffalo Chronicle? They both look real enough. This one is real. The Buffalo Chronicle is actually one of the classic fake news sources. It is just really someone set up a blog, set up a website, and called it the Buffalo Chronicle. But a lot of real news outlets picked up some of their stories, particularly following the 2016 US election. And finally, which of these websites is real? The Shed at Dulwich Restaurant or the Mike the Headless Chicken Festival? Well, maybe you guessed that it's actually Mike the Headless Chicken, because maybe you guessed I was going to make the less likely one, the real one. This is a real festival that's wasn't celebrated this year, unfortunately, but up until 2020, it had been celebrated every year for, I think about 10 years, to celebrate a chicken that lived for a surprisingly long time without its head. The other one, the Shed at Dulwich, was at one point the top rated restaurant in England, despite the fact that it was actually just somebody's shed. He took pictures, made up a fake website to present his shed as a restaurant. He created a TripAdvisor page for it and created a whole bunch of fake reviews. And for some time, his shed was the top rated restaurant in England, despite the fact that it did not actually exist. So maybe you got some of those right. Maybe you kind of guessed where I was going. Probably you didn't get all three right. And that's because there's not necessarily any way to tell just by looking at something whether it's real or not. In any one of those cases, the other one could have been real. The difference between the Buffalo Times and the Buffalo Chronicle, they look about equally real. There's no way to know just by looking at something. Sometimes we share misinformation by accident because we really think something is true and it's not, or sometimes we think other people won't take it seriously. Sometimes people will share content from a parody site like The Onion or the Beaverton and not realize other people might take it seriously. Most of us have probably shared something we thought was real without checking. We're more likely to share things we feel strongly about, especially things that we hope are true. But a lot of the misinformation online isn't trying to get us to believe a particular thing. It's actually designed to make us doubt whether anything is true. So this is an example you can see of two pages that were Facebook pages that were both created by the Russian Internet Research Agency, which was their troll factory. And there was protest on two sides of an issue, both sides of an issue that were started by the same third group. That's why even seemingly harmless examples of misinformation matter. Online misinformation hasn't just made it easier to fool, it's made us more cynical. If we can't tell what's true, it feels safer to assume that everything is fake. And that's something we actually hear a lot from young people. The issue is not that people are too gullible, especially young people. The issue is that they don't feel they know how to verify information. They know that people are trying to fool them, but they don't know how to tell what's true. Critical thinking isn't about doubting everything. It's about learning how to find out what is true, because only truth can break the fake. So in this workshop, we're going to look at 4 steps that we can take to find out if something is true or not. These 4 steps are using fact-checking tools, finding the original source of your information, verifying that source, and checking the information against other sources. Now, once you've learned them, none of these will take you more than a couple of minutes to do, and some will take just 10 seconds. Just one of these will usually get you the answer you need, but it's good to know how to do all four. I'll show you a few different ways to do each one, and then at the end, you get a chance to try them out. Sometimes a single search can break the fake if a professional fact checker has already done the work for you. Thanks to computers, it's easy to make fake pictures, and a lot of times people will share them without knowing that they're fake. Take these photos of the pyramids shared by two popular Twitter accounts, Picology and History Lovers Club. They both look pretty real, don't they? Or do they both look fake? Both accounts have shared plenty of fake and misleading photos. Now, we could do the detective work ourselves, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but it's easier to let somebody else do it. Let's start with the grandparent of all fact-checking sites, Snopes.com. They've been around since the early days of the internet, and they fact-check all kinds of things. When we go to this site and search for Zeppelin over pyramid, we see they've already confirmed this photo is for real. When we search Snopes for pyramid clouds, we find they've also checked this photo out and found that it's false. So it's important to know fact-checking sites don't just debunk. They also confirm when something is true, or sometimes they say it's impossible to tell yet. There are also fact checkers that specialize in different topics like health or politics or different countries. Another way you can see if someone's debunked a false or misleading news story is to do a search for the topic of the story and add the words fake or hoax to your search. So if you see that classic photo that comes up every night, that time there's a big flood, the shark in the subway station, do you want to find out if that's a hoax? Just type in shark in subway station hoax. Now, this can be a bit risky because, of course, anyone can say that something is a hoax. And we've seen that lately. We've seen a lot of cases where people will look so closely at a photograph. And of course, you can look particularly at a photograph, but anything. If you look long enough, you'll find evidence to think that it's faked in some way. So you do need to make sure the people debunking it are reliable. To be sure that a fact checker is reliable, you want to see if they've signed on to the International Fact-Checking Network's Code of Principles. And all of the really reliable ones, AFP, AP Fact Check, Snopes, and so on, have done so. But we've also made a custom search engine you can use at this address to search all of these. So this is bit.ly/fact-search. That's a custom search engine that we've made that will search multiple fact checkers all at the same time. It searches AFP Canada, Associated Press Fact Check, Snopes Fact Can, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, Washington Post Fact Checker, and HoaxEye. So here's an example of how we do this live. This video of Toronto Raptors fans cheering when Golden State Warriors player Kevin Durant got injured was seen and shared more than 1 million times on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. So let's see if you can take 2 minutes. Start by going bit.ly/Durant cheer. Take 2 minutes and see if you can use some of the fact-checking tools that we've just learned about to find out whether this story was true or not. So it'll take just another 30 seconds. When you think you know, you can type in the chat whether you found this story was real or not, and you can put in how you found out. All right, so we have a few responses. So we have one person, Dan says, fake, the game was played at night and the windows are showing the light of day. Okay, that's a bit of deductive reasoning. Now, sometimes that can lead us astray, but that's not a bad answer. Google gave the answer via National Observer. So Google was searching it on Google, found it. Only one result came up on the search engine. Looks convincing and looks real. Yeah, according to a search of Bitly fact search, it is false. Another National Observer going further into the tweets showed the original video. And lots of people found, yes, that link to the National Observer. And so we see that, yeah, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can get the answer by doing a search with the word hoax or fake added, or we can use a custom fact checker search. And either one is likely to lead us to AFP fact check, where we can see the video is a fake. The original is actually from a soccer game in 2016. And once you know that, you can see things like, oh yeah, this doesn't look like a place where you would be watching a basketball game. Again, though, those things can be misleading. So if a professional fact checker has checked it for you, then it's better to listen to them. But Snopes did not have anything on this story, which shows you that just because a fact checker hasn't debunked something doesn't mean it's true. So that's the limit of a fact checker, is that if there isn't an answer there, it doesn't give you evidence one way or another. And of course, a lot of sources like Snopes don't necessarily cover Canadian stories. That's why it's great to be able to search multiple fact checkers at once. But if nobody else has fact checked a story for you, then we need to move on to the next step, find the original source. Because it's so easy to copy and share things online, it's important to find out where something originally came from before we decide whether or not to trust it. Someone might have shared it with us on social media, or a news story might be based on someone else's story. One easy way to find the original source, of course, is to use a search engine. So we might wonder if this post that seems to show a US senator displaying a picture of Aquaman to Congress is real. Pictures, of course, are easy to fake, and pictures where someone is holding a sign are especially easy because all you have to do is change what's on the sign. So that would be trivially easy to fake. So we can do a search for his name, Mike Lee, Aquaman, and C-SPAN, which is where the picture supposedly came from, and open that link to C-SPAN, open it up in a new tab so we can go back quickly if it doesn't pan out. And yeah, we see it actually does come from C-SPAN's footage of the US Congress. So we can see the actual original video from the original source that shows us that, yeah, this really did happen. Another way to find out if a photo like this one of astronomer Carl Sagan is real is to do a reverse image search. We can click on the image, right-click, and select Copy Image Location. And that's slightly different on each browser. This is how you do it, I think, on Firefox. But every browser has some way of telling you how you can copy the image location. So then we can go to a reverse image search like tineye.com, which is my personal favorite, and paste in the address. And I'll show you in a moment why it's my favorite. Because we can sort the results to show the oldest first. You can also sort it to show the most changed, which is a good way of detecting manipulated photos. In this case, we're going to compare it and see what does the oldest photo that looks like this one look like. And we'll see right away there's a different version of the photo. There's one that is actually holding up a sign of the inscription that was placed on the Voyager 2 spacecraft because the idea was it was the first human spacecraft that would ever leave the solar system, so they wanted to put something on it to tell aliens who we were, basically. So that's what he's holding up. And so we know this is the older one, so it's probably the original. But even if something you see is real, it may not be what the source that shared it says it is. This photo, for example, is not actually of Charlie Chaplin, but of an actress named Tommy Talia, and it was taken in the 1950s. That's why we need to follow links in a story until we get to where information actually came from. So here, for instance, this is a Huffington Post story, but we can see it's based on reporting from a New York Times article, and has a quote that came from Twitter. So we can follow those. We can check out to make sure that they're being represented accurately. Now, that's especially important on social networks, where we usually pay more attention to who shared something instead of where it originally came from. And you can see on Facebook, they actually make my name up there as the sharer much more prominent than the actual source. But we need to pay attention to the source. That matters a lot more. Now, if there aren't links in a story, we look for phrases like the New York Times reported, or the word source at the top or bottom of a story. If something presents you with facts or statistics but doesn't tell you where they came from, well, there's no way to know if you can trust them. So here's another Huffington Post story, but it's actually from the wire service Reuters. So it doesn't really matter whether we trust Huffington Post or not. What matters is whether we trust Reuters. This story from Bleacher Report claims that breakdancing and skateboarding are going to become official Olympic events. When we scroll down a bit, we see it's based on earlier stories from Associated Press and Reuters. To make sure Bleacher Report is giving us an accurate picture of what those sources reported, we can follow the links, right-click to open them in new tabs, and we see that this story actually is true. Make sure, though, that a story really is from that source. A lot of websites, including many reliable ones like Reuters, carry sponsored content, paid links to stories on other sites. So the main story here, the breakdancing one, is actually from Reuters, and so we know it's probably true. But everything at the top and everything on the right-hand bar, this is sponsored content. And just the fact that it's on the Reuters page doesn't tell us anything because it has different authors. If there aren't links in a story, we can do a search for the topic plus the sources that are given. So if it referred to a Reuters story but didn't give a link, we could do a search for breakdancing Olympics Reuters, and that leads us again straight to the real story. We can also use reverse image search to see if a photo really is what it seems to be. According to this tweet, this photo shows a terrible mess left behind after an environmentalist protest, but following the steps we learned a few minutes ago shows the picture's actually from a concert in 2014. So the photo was real, the mess is real, but the context, which is crucially important here, is quite different. Now it's your turn. Did explorers really find hundreds of animals that were thought to be extinct at a place called the Lost City of the Monkey God? We'll take a few minutes to find the original source of this story, start at bit.ly/monkeygod, and see if it's true or not. Once again, once you think you know, post your answer and how you found it in the chat. We'll take 2 minutes. All right, so we're starting to see answers. Jenny Park says it's true. The source is Conrad Duncan. A quick search of him shows he's a real reporter with The Independent. That's good. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Dan says found references on CNN and National Geographic. All right. New York Times article. So there's lots of different ways we could find this out. We're going to focus now on following our source. So it probably didn't take you very long, most people, to see that this story was true. Now, starting with the link, the Twitter link, we go to All That's Interesting. Now, there's no particular reason to think All That's Interesting is a very reliable source, but when we scroll down just a bit, we can see the story came from The Independent, a well-known British newspaper. So once again, it doesn't matter whether or not All That's Interesting is a reliable source, even if we've heard of it or not. What matters is who is the original source. If we couldn't track the story any further, then we would care whether or not All That's Interesting is a reliable source. But we can track it all the way to The Independent, and then we can be pretty satisfied that it's reliable. But what if you didn't know whether The Independent was a reliable source? After all, there are newspapers around the world. There are new ones starting all the time. There are TV news outlets. There are reliable online news sources. Think of all of the different, just the cities in Canada. If you've never been to Victoria, or you don't live in BC, you might not know whether or not the Times Colonist was the actual newspaper in Victoria, or similar with almost any place you can think of. So, and how do we know if that's their real website? So even if we know that The Independent is a reliable source, how do we know that's the actual website? So we'll answer all those questions as we look at our third step, verify the source. Whether we're looking at a website, a photo or video, or a news story, what really matters is whether or not the people who originally created it are trustworthy. You can't always confirm something is false, but if the source isn't reliable, you have no reason to believe it. Now, this is the only time when it matters what order you do the steps in. Reliable sources do sometimes share things that turn out not to be true. And unreliable sources share things that are true. So a number of sources that specialize in spreading disinformation, like RT as an example, or Sputnik, they also share a lot of legitimate news stories, and it's to build up legitimacy. So you can't assume just because something appeared in an unreliable source that it's not reliable. That's why we shouldn't bother verifying a source until we know for sure it's where the information originally came from. So again, if we hadn't heard of The Independent, there would be no point in searching to verify it until we found out that it's the original source. And that's why we didn't want to waste our time verifying All That's Interesting, because it wasn't the original source. You only verify the source when you're sure it's the original. Now, when we do verify, we need to ask 3 questions. So our first question is, does this source really exist? We saw earlier how easy it is to make fake pictures online. It's just as easy to make a fake website or a social media profile. Second, are they who they say they are? It's easy to impersonate people online and create imposter sites or social network accounts. And finally, are they reliable? Anyone can claim to be an expert online, so you need to make sure there are good reasons to think that someone is a reliable source. Now, these days, it's easy to make websites that look just as slick and professional as anything that's out there. In fact, some trustworthy sources may look less professional than fake sites because they haven't put time or money into updating their website. A lot of university websites, a lot of government websites, a lot of nonprofit websites look kind of chintzy. Because that's just not something they have money and time for. Sometimes they look like they haven't been updated in 10 years, or in the case of this actual Yale School of Art website, which I can only assume is intentionally, looks like this on purpose, it looks like it hasn't been updated in about 25 years. So that's why we can't use how slick and professional something is as an indicator of reliability. It's actually less than useful because the people who intentionally create disinformation, they know that that's something that we look for. And so they do put a lot of effort into making professional looking websites. People who spread misinformation on purpose will often invent local newspapers or TV stations. This kind of source seems trustworthy because most of us aren't likely to have heard of a paper or TV station in a different city or country. So again, if you don't live in Australia, you may never have heard of the Courier Mail. You have no idea whether it's real or not. It is real. Here are two websites that claim to be from Sherbrooke, Quebec, the Times and the Record. Which one is real? Both of them have an About Us or Contact Us page with a street and an email address and the names of people who work there. But then all of that is easy to fake. In fact, you don't want to waste your time on what a source tells you about themselves, because obviously that's easy to fake. What you need to do is look for what reliable third sources have to say about them. And our first step for that is usually Wikipedia. Let's go to Wikipedia and see if there's an article there about the Sherbrooke Record. You don't have to go to Wikipedia to search. You can just put what you're looking for in the search box and add Wikipedia. Saves you a little time. From the Wikipedia article, we can see the Record has been around for more than a century, and there's no reason to think that it isn't a reliable source. How about the Times? There isn't an article about it in Wikipedia, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not real. Wikipedia is written by volunteers, so a lot of things don't have entries. And again, just like with fact checkers, that's particularly true of things outside of the United States, like in Canada. A lot of things that are perfectly real and legitimate in Canada don't have Wikipedia entries. Instead, we can do a search on Google. Now, the only results we can find for the Sherbrooke Times are the website itself, its Twitter account, and articles pointing out that it's a fake. So we can say pretty firmly that it's not for real, or certainly we don't have any evidence to trust it. Our second question is, are they who they say they are? It's easy to pretend to be someone else online. So once you know the source really exists, you need to find out if what you're looking at really came from them. For instance, did Toronto police really put out a warning about a man in a Spider-Man costume webbing streetcar lines? Well, some social networks like Twitter and Instagram verify users by putting a blue check mark next to their name. Now, it's important to know the blue check mark does not mean they're necessarily a reliable source, but it does mean that they are who they say they are. That is the only thing it means. It means they have been verified as being who they say they are. Now, in this case, it means this is a real Toronto police account, which means this story about Spider-Man is true. It's a bit harder to make sure you're on the right website. People have made fake versions of real news websites like The Guardian and the CBC that look almost exactly like the real thing. These are both fake websites. And if you can tell the difference between that CBC website and the real one, then your eyes are sharper than mine. But there are things that are harder to fake. Now, just like an account being verified, a web address by itself does not tell you if a site is reliable. For instance, sites with .org addresses aren't necessarily more trustworthy. Anyone can get a .org address, but the web address can tell you if you're on an organization's real website. So if you want to know if you're on the real CBC page, you want to make sure that it starts with cbc.ca. If you want to make sure you're on the real UNESCO page, you can check. If you're satisfied that a source is real and is who they say they are, you have to find out whether they're trustworthy. For sources of general information like newspapers, that means asking if they have a process for making sure they're giving you good information and a good track record of doing it. This becomes important when you're looking at sources that aren't fake, but that may give you only part of the story or may not have high standards in making sure what they post is accurate. Now, unreliable sources sometimes do share things that are true, and as we can see here, even reliable sources sometimes make mistakes. But in general, if you see a story from a source you know is reliable, you can assume it's probably true. Let's look at another pair of newspapers, the Washington Times and the Washington Post. They're both real newspapers, and neither one is entirely unreliable, but one's more reliable than the other. There are signs we can look at to decide how reliable a news source is. How often do they make mistakes? If they do make mistakes, do they admit them and publish corrections? And are they willing to publish things their owners, or more importantly, their readers, wouldn't agree with? If we look up the Washington Post on Wikipedia, we see it's been around since 1877 and has won 47 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism. Now, it's not perfect. They've published a few stories that turned out to be inaccurate, which they retracted and corrected publicly. But overall, it has a good track record. The Washington Times has also been around for a while, since 1982, but their track record isn't as good. Most of the Wikipedia article is about times they've spread misinformation about everything from the ozone layer to secondhand smoke. That doesn't mean the Times is an entirely unreliable source or that the Post never makes mistakes, but it does mean most of the time you'll do a lot better trusting the Post. For more specialized sources, you want to ask whether they're experts or authorities on that topic. Being an expert is more than just being a doctor, a scientist, or a professor. We have to make sure they're an expert in the right field. A cardiologist would be an expert in treating your heart, but not on vaccines. Some sources, like certain professional groups or government agencies, are recognized authorities on particular topics. What they say carries more weight than any single expert in the field, and a lot more than a person or group who isn't an authority. How do we know who's an authority? Well, remember, anyone can call themselves a university, like Prager University, which is not a university, or call themselves an institute on the internet. This news story on how to get cheaper flights is based on a survey by an organization called Skyscanner. Now, the advice in it, including the tip to book through a travel website instead of directly from an airline, comes from Alex Astaniev, one of their travel industry experts. A search for Skyscanner shows us that they actually are a travel website, while a search for Astaniev's name shows he's actually their product manager. Remember, a LinkedIn page, like any other social network account, is easy to fake, so you'll want to get at least one more piece of evidence. Now we know Skyscanner is not an authority, and Astaniev is not an expert. In fact, they have a vested interest in trying to convince us not to book through a travel website instead of going directly to the airlines. So here we're going to take a look, and then we're just for time, I'm going to just walk us through this one. Two similar looking groups, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Pediatricians. Both of them claim to represent American pediatricians. So which one are we more likely to trust? You can see they both have very professional looking websites. They both sound like they have legitimate organizations. They both have .org web addresses. They both claim to represent Canadian pediatricians, but if we do a search for the AAP and scroll past the result for their own website, we can see they have 64,000 doctors as members. A search for the ACP shows they have just 500 members and a much weaker claim to be an authority on children's health. Looking more closely at the ACP shows it's not just unreliable because it's not an authority, though. Like Skyscanner, it also has a strong bias. The whole reason its members split from the AAP was because they were opposed to letting gay and lesbian parents adopt children. It's important not to mix up authority and bias. Now, someone who's actually an expert on something will have stronger opinions about it than someone who isn't, but they'll be better informed opinions too. The difference is that the AAP's positions on everything from car seats to when the school day should start are based on the expertise of their members, while the ACP's are based on their beliefs about sexuality. Our last step, check other sources, may sometimes be the last one you do, but it could also be the first. It's a quick way of sifting out bias and finding out whether something like a news story is for real. Did this politician really do a Facebook Live video with a cat face filter on? If we do a search for Pakistani politician cat filter and switch to the news tab, we see the story was covered by many different news outlets, from Global News in Canada to the BBC. And that's the news tab in Google is a much more reliable source than the general, than the all tab, because it's been curated. It doesn't have just everything. In this step, we're not worried about the reliability of a single source. We're looking for a consensus among mostly reliable sources that something actually happened. That's why the news tab is better than the main search, because it's more curated. Not every source that's included is perfectly reliable, but they're all news outlets that really exist. This step is also important for getting context, making sure we get the whole story. Remember, all sources make mistakes sometimes, but reliable ones correct them. Consulting other sources can help you find out if the first place you saw something might have been leaving something out. That's a good way of dealing with the possible bias in any one source. It's one of the great things about the internet. It's just as easy to take a look at three stories, three articles on the same story from three completely different sources and compare them. It doesn't really take that much longer than reading just one article, and it gives you a really good idea of whether anything's being left out. We can also use this step to find out whether something fits with what most of the experts on that topic agree, what's called the consensus view. In fields like medicine, science, and history, consensus has been built up over time, with each new piece of evidence tilting the scales in its favor. Something that goes against the consensus may turn out to be right, but it needs more and better evidence to outweigh the consensus. While it's generally good to give both sides of a story, including views that experts agree aren't right can actually spread misinformation. So an article on the pyramids doesn't have to mention some people think they were built by aliens. News outlets and Wikipedia aren't always the best place to look for consensus on health and science because the people writing the articles often aren't experts. For those topics, you want to turn to sources you know are authorities. In this video, they claim the North Pole is moving. We've made another custom search that looks just at sources whose writers are experts in the fields they wrote about. It's bit.ly science-search, and it looks at Scientific American, Canadian Geographic, Nature, Science News, and so on. So if we do a quick search for North Pole moving, that tells us that while not every detail in that video might be true, it is true that the magnetic pole is shifting. We can use this step together with the last one by building our own toolbox of sources that we've confirmed are reliable. So you can create your own custom search engine if you have a Google account, and you can add to it any source that you found that you consider to be reliable to search them all at once rather than searching the entire web. Here's another example. According to this article in the Express, scientists of NASA have said we're heading into a solar minimum, which may cause a mini ice age. If we take a look at this, we can check with all three of the different skills we've covered in this step, though each one would give the answer by itself. If we do a search, a news search for solar minimum ice age, we find that most of the results in this are that story in the Express, and the others are sources you probably never heard of. If no other sources are covering something, it's probably not really news. We can quickly check the Wikipedia article on solar minimum by pressing Control F and searching for ice age, which shows it isn't even mentioned. If we want to take another minute and browse the article, we'll see the term solar minimum refers to sunspots and solar flares. It has nothing to do with the surface temperature on the Earth. And finally, a search of our expert sources shows us that while the solar minimum is real, it won't result in colder weather here on Earth. Now you've learned all the steps. It probably wouldn't take you more than a minute to check either of those. That's good because for misinformation to spread, people like us have to share it. Let's wrap up with a final test. Have people really found rice with plastic mixed up in it? Is this beautiful lake actually a toxic waste dump? For each one, pick which of the steps we've covered you think will be the quickest way to verify it and try that first. If that doesn't work, go on to another one. Now, with everything that you've done, it'll probably only take you about 2 minutes to check them both. So when you think we're going to take 2 minutes, when you think you have the answer, post it in the chat, and again, tell us how you did it. And I'll just go back for a second. It's bit.ly/science-search is the science search URL. And I've seen already one question posted that I have filed for when we get to the end. But as you're taking a look at these, if you've thought of questions, you can put them in the chat as well. So we're going to have the last 10 minutes for questions. All right, see, people are starting to post what they found and how they found it. That's great. Take another minute or so. All right, so we're starting to get answers. So with one answer, someone checked Snopes, found that the rice story is fake. BBC, New York Times, and USA Today all confirmed the lake is a toxic waste dump. Plastic rice is fake according to Wikipedia. New York Times says toxic lake is true. Toxic lake true, New York Times. All right, so let's take a look at them one at a time. There are a few different ways we can fact check each of these, but in each case, there's one quickest way. As we saw, several fact checking sites have already debunked the plastic rice story, so we can easily find out that that's false. As we've seen, there are a number of other ways we could check it, but that's probably the quickest way to do it. For the second story, all we have to do is follow the links in the original source to see that it's from the New York Times. And so it's probably true. Again, it's not that everyone makes mistakes sometimes, but it's pretty unlikely that the New York Times is going to make a mistake about this. There are other ways of checking it. All of them are valid. That's probably our quickest way from where we started. If you'd seen it somewhere else, there might have been another quickest way. But because that story did lead directly to the New York Times site, it's probably the fastest way. Just to be sure, we can check the web address to make sure this is the real New York Times site. That's why it's important for us to take these steps to double check. And most of you probably only took about a minute to check each one. And that's really important. It's really important that we treat fact checking as something that we do every time. And that we recognize that is something we can do quickly. We have to practice it. It doesn't take that much practice to be able to do it pretty quickly. But these tools, being able to fact check, use fact checking tools, being in the habit of finding the original source, especially when things are shared through social media. You always have to follow the source when something is shared through social media. Verifying the source, which really most of the time is not going to take more than a minute or so, and checking other sources, particularly with news. And so much of it is patience. It's waiting until we can confirm something, particularly before we share it. We have to take these steps to double check before we share anything we see online every time, because only we can break the fake. So thank you. We have there are a couple of questions I'm going to address in the time we have left, but also feel free to visit mediasmarts.ca, or if you have a question that you think of afterwards, feel free to email me. That's my email address on there. So I'll go back to the question. So we had a question early on about Wikipedia. How reliable is Wikipedia? The answer is that for getting general consensus, Wikipedia is pretty reliable. Wikipedia is an example of how hard it is to regain trust, because in the first couple of years that it was around, it was not super reliable, and they've put enormous amounts of effort into making it more reliable, to the point where most of the time it is your best source for getting general consensus, because there are not very many other sources where you can look up a news organization, or a nonprofit or a website or something like that, and get basically neutral information about it. So when you're looking for an organization, when you're looking for a website, you want to find out, are they for real, and do they have a bias? Do they have authority? Are they some kind of astroturfing organization? And we know that's an example where there are a lot of organizations that set themselves up with sounding neutral, and they exist basically to push a particular kind of policy. So Skyscanner was an example. All we had to do was check out Skyscanner. We saw they weren't really an expert source. They had their own agenda, which was to get us to pay them money rather than going straight to the airlines. And similarly, there are a lot, the meat industry, the cereal industry, this industry, that industry, they set up all of these astroturf organizations, or they're organizations that exist to push a particular political point of view. If you heard, for instance, if you saw the National Policy Institute, from just the name, you would have no way of knowing that this was a white supremacist organization or a far-right racist organization, but it is. That's what's called a cloaked hate site. It's run by a hate group. It uses kind of a neutral sounding name and a professional looking website to launder its content. The quickest way to find that out is just to go to Wikipedia, and it'll tell you. Now, there are ways that you can verify, that you can tell whether a Wikipedia article is reliable. So every Wikipedia article has a talk page that shows you, you just have to click on it, and it shows you how that article is rated. So if there are serious problems with the article, it'll say there on the talk page. And Wikipedia articles that have serious problems also have banners on them that tell you what's wrong with them. So if something has been vandalized, if something is not neutral, then it's going to show up there. You can also check the edits. If you look at the history, it'll show you. So if an article is clearly in the middle of an edit war, then you know you have to come back later. It's not really reliable right then. You can follow some of the sources. But in general, Wikipedia is pretty reliable, and I'll give you an example. Some of you have probably seen the hippo in the background. Of course, that's the North American house hippo. There is a Wikipedia article on the house hippo, and someone at one point changed the article to say that house hippos are real. And this lasted about half an hour before that was recognized by one of the automated editors and reverted. It was recognized as vandalism and was reverted. So for only a half an hour did Wikipedia say that the house hippo was real. We have a lesson on our website. It's called Taming the Wild Wiki, and it is designed to teach kids how, it's for grades 7 and 9, but you can use it a little below and a little above if you want. And it's great for teaching kids how to use Wikipedia effectively. All right, our second question, the political story fact-checking site. So the one that focuses on politics is called PolitiFact, but unfortunately it focuses primarily on American politics, as you can imagine. There's also a fact checker called FactsCan, but it's not updated that often. There's not, unfortunately, the money for it. So that's one of the reasons we created the custom search, which is bit.ly/fact-search, and it searches a bunch of them all at once. Again, they don't always get Canadian stories, but it's better to search them all at once. Someone else, can't web addresses be faked? So again, Wikipedia or Google are a good way to do it. So if you see a link to something and you want to know if the web address is real, if you see a CBC article, a New York Times article, if you see a link to, someone says, hey, this is a MediaSmart's page, then you go to Google or Wikipedia and you see what they say is the real page. So if you see someone says, the link says mediasmarts.org, and you Google MediaSmarts and it shows that the real one is mediasmarts.ca, which it is, then you have an idea that maybe this is not true. how would you suggest that we approach people in groups that believe fake news that can impact others? For example, the belief that coronavirus is not real. So we actually do have a whole other program, which is called Check Then Share. It's actually called Check First, Share After, but the website is checkthenshare.ca. And that's focused specifically, in fact, on health and specifically coronavirus information. And one of the things that we have there is a really great infographic on responding to misinformation. But basically, what it comes down to is that there are 3 things you can do, and you could always do one of them, and all of them are likely to be effective in some way. So the first thing that you can do is to simply ask a question. So the question can be, are you sure that's true? Or where did you hear that? Or where are your facts from? Just asking that question actually has been shown, and this is based on really good quality research, just asking a question like that has been shown to be likely to get people to change their minds, as likely as almost anything else. But more importantly, it's likely to reduce the impact of what they're saying on other listeners. And that's the thing that I want you to come away with, is that when you're talking to someone like that, you're not likely to convince them, not then and there. If they do change their mind, it'll be later. No one ever changes their mind in the middle of an argument. You might change their minds later. But what you really want to worry about, especially when we're talking online, is the other people who are seeing the message. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram or wherever, and you see someone sharing misinformation or disinformation, especially if it's about something really important like that, keep in mind, if nobody challenges it, then all the other people who see it are more likely to believe it. So just asking the question often forces them to back up a little bit, or it'll show other people who are paying attention. It'll kind of inoculate them. So the second one is to correct them. So if you have good information, and then one of the things that we provide on the checkthenshare.ca site are links to good information on coronavirus and related issues in quite a few different languages from every provincial public health authority. If you can correct it and say, actually, that's not true, and here is the actual information, the correct information. Give sources. If you're going to correct, you give sources and you say, this is the real information and this is why it's more reliable. You still may not change their mind, but again, you have an impact. You may have a delayed impact and you have an impact on the listeners. And the third thing that you can do is debunk it. And that's when you can show that something has been disproven. So if it's something like something that came up, let's say a therapy, someone's recommending a therapy or a treatment that was maybe investigated early on, like something like hydroxychloroquine, if you're able to, you can show, oh no, actually that was investigated and it was found that that wasn't effective. Or, you know, if someone is spreading some misinformation about where it came from, about it supposedly escaping from a lab, you can say, oh no, that was actually been debunked, that's been investigated. But those two, correcting and debunking, you can really only do, you should only do them if you have the good information to replace the bad information. But you can always do something, because just asking a question, just saying, are you sure, or where did you get your information, can be really effective. And thank you, Dan, for sharing that link. And I think that brings us to our time. So once again, if anyone had a question and they didn't get a chance to ask it, please feel free to email me. Meanwhile, thank you so much for all your kind attention.
Matthew, it's us that need to thank you very, very much. I can say that both as a teacher and as a parent, I found those 4 steps to be critically important and also very, very practical. So you talked about using fact-checking tools, finding the original source, verifying the source, and checking other sources. I think that if we had more time, we could certainly go on. And I know I speak on behalf of all the participants when I say that it was an hour very, very well spent. If we had another hour, we could certainly fill it. So this does bring us to the end of the session. We invite all of you as participants to view the resources and the recording of the event on the conference page, which is shown there on the slide that you see, digitalresilience.ca. And we also encourage you, please, to tweet about the conference session using the hashtag Digital Resilience 2021 and to tag us on social media. So Matthew, thanks not only for the presentation and not only for answering the questions, but also making yourself available afterwards in case people have follow-up comments or questions. We're delighted that you are open to receiving them. So the presentation was phenomenal. Thanks very much for this information on Break the Fake framework. It certainly supports young people build habits and skills for identifying misinformation, verifying reliable sources, and developing good online citizenship practice. So it was truly a pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks one and all for attending. Merci à toutes et à tous d'avoir assisté à la séance, and we wish you very, very well. Take good care.
Bye.